Picture an ancient human sitting by a fire. Not unusual. Fire was the center of ancient social life, the place where the group gathered, where food was prepared, where the day wound down into evening, and the evening wound down into night. Every ancient human who ever lived spent a significant portion of their life sitting near a fire. It was the most consistent, most universal feature of ancient human existence for at least 1,000,000 years. Now picture that same ancient human noticing something. The fire is burning through a particular plant. Maybe it was gathered with the fuel wood accidentally. Maybe it fell in from an overhanging branch. Maybe someone tossed it in deliberately to see what would happen. The smoke coming off this plant is different from regular wood smoke. It has a different smell. And when the ancient human breathes it in, not deliberately, just as a natural consequence of sitting near a fire that is producing it, something changes. A mild shift in perception, a slight relaxation of muscle tension, a subtle alteration in the quality of their awareness. They notice, because ancient humans noticed everything. Their survival depended on noticing things, on building accurate mental models of cause and effect in the natural world, on updating those models when new information arrived. And the information arriving right now is, this plant does something when it burns, something that affects the mind. What happens next is one of the oldest stories in human experience, and it leads directly to the question we're exploring today. Did ancient humans actually smoke? And if they did, what were they smoking? Why were they smoking it? And what does it tell us about the inner lives and the deliberate experimentation of people who lived before civilization had a name? The answers involve some genuinely extraordinary evidence, including, as you will discover, a smoking pipe that is significantly older than anyone expected. Let's establish the biological context first, because it is foundational to everything else. The human brain contains specific receptor systems for the active compounds in several of the plants that ancient humans most commonly encountered. The endocannabinoid system, the receptor network that responds to THC, the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis, is one of the most widespread receptor systems in the human central nervous system. It is involved in regulating mood, appetite, pain perception, memory consolidation, and stress response. It is present in virtually every region of the brain that matters for conscious experience. This system did not evolve because cannabis exists. It evolved for entirely endogenous reasons. The body produces its own cannabinoid-like compounds that use this system for normal regulatory functions. Cannabis happens to produce compounds that fit these receptors with extraordinary precision, hijacking a system that was already there for other purposes. The same is true of opioid receptors, which respond to compounds in the poppy family. The same is true of nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, which respond to nicotine from the tobacco family. The same is true of serotonin receptors, which respond to compounds in various psychedelic plants. Ancient human brains were full of these receptor systems, operating exactly as they operate in modern human brains because they are ancient systems that we inherited from evolutionary ancestors who never encountered any of these plants. The plants that produce psychoactive compounds did not create the receptors. They found receptors that were already there and exploited them. What this means for the ancient smoking question is important. Ancient humans were neurologically primed to respond to these plant compounds in exactly the way modern humans respond to them. The first time an ancient human inhaled smoke from a burning cannabis plant, their endocannabinoid receptors responded. The experience was real, physiologically grounded, and neurologically significant. Whatever the cultural framework through which that experience was interpreted, and ancient humans almost certainly interpreted unusual psychological experiences through frameworks very different from modern pharmacological ones. The underlying neurochemical reality was the same then as it is now. Now let's talk about the direct archaeological evidence, because this is where things get genuinely exciting. In 2019, archaeologists excavating a burial site in the Pamir Mountains of western China, specifically at a site called Zhangkal Cemetery, dating to approximately 2,500 years ago, found wooden braziers with residues that, when analyzed using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, showed high concentrations of THC, cannabidiol, and other cannabis compounds. The residue patterns suggested that cannabis with unusually high THC content had been burned in these braziers, and that people had deliberately positioned themselves to inhale the resulting smoke. This is direct chemical evidence of deliberate cannabis inhalation, documented in a ritual mortuary context. Now, 2,500 years ago is not technically in the purely ancient period before civilization. The Scythian cultures of that region had complex social structures and material culture. But the significance of this find for our question is what it implies about the period before the archaeological record captures it clearly. Cannabis is not a plant that ancient humans encountered, ignored for tens of thousands of years, and then suddenly started using 2,500 years ago. The cultivation and use of cannabis has been traced backward through the archaeological and genetic record continuously, with evidence evidence of cannabis pollen and seeds at human habitation sites going back at least 12,000 years in parts of Asia and the Caucasus. The Jerzankal evidence is the clearest chemical confirmation of deliberate smoking behavior, but it represents the visible tip of a behavioral iceberg that extends much further into the past. Let's talk about tobacco, because tobacco has its own ancient story that is separate from cannabis and equally remarkable. Tobacco is plants of the genus Nicotiana is native to the Americas. The archaeological evidence for tobacco use in ancient American contexts is substantial and old. Radiocarbon-dated tobacco seeds have been found at archaeological sites in the American Southwest, dating to approximately 12,300 years ago, more than 12,000 years before the present, deep in the ancient period before any settled civilization in the Americas. In 2021, a study published in the journal Nature Human Behavior documented the finding of nicotine residue in a small pouch found at a site in Utah, associated with ancient materials, along with seeds from 4 different tobacco species. The analysis confirmed that multiple tobacco species were being collected and almost certainly consumed. The dating placed this use at approximately 12,300 years ago, pushing back the confirmed evidence of tobacco use in the Americas by several thousand years beyond previous estimates. The mechanism of tobacco consumption in ancient American contexts was not necessarily smoking in the cigarette sense. Tobacco was chewed, snuffed, and smoked in pipes. The evidence of ancient pipe technology in the Americas goes back several thousand years, with pipes found at multiple ancient American sites showing tobacco residue. The diversity of consumption methods suggests a long period of experimentation with the plant's properties, consistent with people who had been working with it for a very long time. Here is the staggering implication. If ancient humans in the Americas were using tobacco 12,000 years ago, and the Americas were populated by people crossing from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, then tobacco use potentially began within a few thousand years of the initial peopling of the Americas. The people who became the first Americans may have discovered and begun using tobacco remarkably quickly after arriving in an environment that contained it, consistent with a species that actively and systematically explored the pharmacological properties of new plant environments. Let's talk about a find that dramatically shifted the timeline of known smoking technology in the ancient world. In 2013, archaeologists working at a site in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia found smoking pipe fragments that, based on associated materials and radiocarbon dating, appeared to be approximately 3,000 years old, significantly older than previously documented pipe technology in that region. Subsequent years produced additional finds pushing pipe technology in various regions further back. But more relevant to our ancient period is the evidence from fire and plant remains. Pipes are just the technology that makes smoking convenient and repeatable. Before pipes, smoking almost certainly occurred through simpler means: direct inhalation of smoke from burning plant material in open fires, or through simple reed or hollow bone tubes that would leave minimal archaeological traces. The absence of preserved pipe technology does not indicate the absence of smoking behavior. It indicates the absence of preserved evidence for it. The ancient hearth record is instructive here. Analysis of plant remains from ancient fire sites has documented the presence of multiple psychoactive plant species in direct association with ancient human habitation across different continents. Hemp family plants appear in ancient hearth contexts in Central Asia, dating back tens of thousands of years. Various nightshade family plants, several of which contain psychoactive alkaloids, appear in ancient European and Asian fire contexts. The interpretation of these remains is always cautious. Plants ended up in ancient fires for many reasons, but the pattern of specific psychoactive plants appearing repeatedly in ancient human fire contexts is consistent with deliberate use rather than accidental accumulation. Let's talk about the plants themselves, because the ancient pharmacological landscape was not limited to cannabis and tobacco. Ancient humans who spent their lives in intimate contact with the natural world, who had accumulated tens of thousands of years of systematic botanical knowledge, who had developed what was essentially an empirical pharmacology through generations of observation and experimentation. These were people who knew their local plant life in extraordinary detail. They knew which plants were edible, which were poisonous, which had medicinal properties, and which produced unusual psychological effects. The Datura family, plants containing tropane alkaloids including scopolamine and atropine, is native to both the Americas and the Old World. Datura produces intense hallucinogenic experiences at doses only modestly above toxic levels, making it one of the most dangerous psychoactive plants known. And yet it appears in ancient ritual contexts across multiple cultures with no historical contact, suggesting that its properties were independently discovered and deliberately used despite its dangers. In Europe and the Middle East, the ancient henbane plant, Hyoscyamus niger, contains the same alkaloids as datura, and has been found in archaeological contexts associated with ancient human habitation, going back thousands of years. Henbane seeds have been found in ancient ritual deposits, in contexts suggesting they were burned as offerings. And burning henbane seeds produces inhalable amounts of its psychoactive compounds. Psilocybin-containing mushrooms, species that produce intense psychedelic experiences, are distributed across every inhabited continent. There is no ancient human population that did not have access to psilocybin mushrooms in their local environment. The rock art evidence from multiple ancient sites, including sites in North Africa, dated to approximately 9,000 years ago, that appear to depict humanoid figures holding mushroom-like objects and experiencing visual phenomena consistent with psilocybin intoxication, has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of ancient psychedelic mushroom use. The ephedra plant, containing ephedrine, a stimulant, was present across ancient Eurasian environments and appears in ancient ritual contexts going back thousands of years. The ancient Vedic texts from South Asia describe a ritual drink called soma that was associated with divine experience, and was prepared from a plant whose identity remains debated, but that several researchers have proposed may have been ephedra or an ephedra-containing preparation. Ancient humans were surrounded by pharmacologically active plants. They were species specifically primed to respond to those plants' active compounds, and they were, by nature, systematic experimenters with their environment. Let's address the fire-smoke dimension directly, because this is one of the most underappreciated aspects of ancient human psychoactive experience. Ancient humans lived with smoke. Every ancient human who inhabited the northern latitudes spent extended periods in enclosed shelters with open fires that were the primary source of warmth, light, and cooking capacity during the long winter months. The ventilation of ancient shelters was adequate to prevent acute carbon monoxide poisoning, but not necessarily adequate to keep smoke concentrations at levels that modern occupational health standards would consider acceptable. Regular exposure to wood smoke containing terpenes and other volatile organic compounds from various burned plants is mildly psychoactive. The altered state of perception that accompanies extended exposure to smoke in an enclosed environment, the slightly dreamlike quality, the loosening of normal attentional constraints, the increased vividness of imagination, was a regular feature of ancient human indoor experience during cold months. This baseline level of smoke exposure matters for understanding how ancient humans might have discovered and interpreted the effects of psychoactive plants burned in fires. The altered states produced by specific psychoactive plants burning in an ancient shelter were not entering a baseline of complete sobriety. They were modifying a baseline that already included some degree of smoke-induced altered perception. The experience would have been qualitatively distinctive, clearly different from ordinary wood smoke, but not entirely without context in the phenomenological landscape of ancient indoor experience. There is also the specific case of ancient ritual fire contexts. Multiple ancient ritual and ceremonial sites show evidence of fires built in enclosed spaces, caves, stone chambers, constructed enclosures, where ventilation was deliberately restricted. The archaeological evidence of specific plant materials burned in these contexts, combined with the enclosed spaces that would concentrate smoke and maximize inhalation, is consistent with deliberately engineered altered states as part of ritual practice. Now let's engage with the deeper question this evidence raises. What did ancient humans make of these experiences? Ancient humans did not have a pharmacological framework for understanding what was happening when a psychoactive plant altered their perception. They had an experiential framework, the framework of a world understood as populated by forces, presences, and agencies both visible and invisible, in which altered states of consciousness were naturally interpreted as encounters with those invisible dimensions of reality. This is not a condescending characterization of ancient cognition. It is a description of what any sensible person would conclude from the phenomenology of a psychedelic experience in the absence of a materialist explanatory framework. When you ingest a sufficiently powerful psychedelic compound, and your sensory experience transforms radically, when you perceive patterns and presences and meanings that are not accessible to ordinary consciousness, when the boundaries between self and world become porous, the most reasonable interpretation of that experience, given no knowledge knowledge of receptor pharmacology is that you have accessed a dimension of reality that is normally hidden. Ancient humans who deliberately used psychoactive plants were not doing something irrational. They were systematically exploring a category of experience that their environment made available, interpreting it through the best explanatory frameworks they had, and embedding that exploration in social and ritual contexts that gave it meaning and managed its risks. The healer, or ritual specialist in many ancient communities, was almost certainly the primary custodian of psychoactive plant knowledge. The specific plants, their preparation, the conditions of their use, the interpretive framework for understanding the experiences they produced, all of this was specialized knowledge held by specific individuals, transmitted with the same care that any critical survival knowledge was transmitted. The misuse of powerful psychoactive plants could be lethal. The knowledge of how to use them safely and meaningfully was consequently treated as both sacred and dangerous. Let's talk about what the evidence tells us about the social context of ancient smoking and psychoactive plant use, because the social context is as important as the behavior itself. The overwhelming weight of ethnographic evidence from traditional societies that have maintained ancient practices of psychoactive plant use shows that these practices are embedded in profoundly social and ritual contexts. They are not typically private recreational behaviors, they are communal events, organized by recognized specialists, held at specific times and for specific purposes, and interpreted within shared frameworks of meaning. Healing ceremonies, coming-of-age initiations, preparations for significant communal decisions, rituals for communicating with ancestors or with forces believed to govern natural cycles. These are the contexts in which psychoactive plant use appears most consistently across traditional cultures worldwide. The plants are not recreational drugs in the contemporary sense. They are tools for accessing specific states of consciousness that are valued for specific purposes in specific social contexts. This cross-cultural consistency is significant. When the same pattern of psychoactive plant use, specialist-mediated, ritually embedded, communally significant, appears independently in cultures across every inhabited continent, it suggests not cultural diffusion but a convergent response to something universal. The human capacity for altered consciousness, the human tendency to interpret that consciousness within frameworks of meaning, and the human instinct to embed powerful experiences in social structures that manage their risks and amplify their benefits. Ancient humans almost certainly practiced something recognizable as this pattern. The specialists who managed the community's psychoactive plant knowledge were the ancestors, not in a direct historical lineage necessarily, but in a functional and social sense. Of every healer, shaman, and ritual specialist documented in the ethnographic record. Let's talk about nicotine specifically, because nicotine's pharmacology tells a particularly interesting story about ancient human behavior. Nicotine acts on acetylcholine receptors in the brain, producing effects that include increased alertness, improved attention and working memory, reduced appetite, and mild mood elevation. These are not trivial functional effects. In the ancient context, increased alertness and improved attention could directly translate to better hunting performance, sharper environmental monitoring, and enhanced social cognition. Reduced appetite is relevant during periods of food scarcity, when the ability to suppress hunger and maintain functional behavior despite insufficient caloric intake could be the difference between a productive day and an unproductive one. The functional effects of nicotine are specifically well suited to the cognitive demands of ancient life in a way that is not coincidental. Natural selection, operating over generations, would have maintained and amplified the tendency to use a substance whose functional effects directly enhanced survival-relevant cognitive performance. Ancient humans who used tobacco or other nicotine-containing plants may have been self-medicating for the cognitive demands of their lives in a way that was genuinely adaptive rather than merely habituating. The same argument applies in different forms to the other psychoactive plants. Cannabis has documented anti-inflammatory and analgesic effects that would have been genuinely medically relevant in a world without pharmaceutical pain management. Opioid compounds provide pain relief and stress reduction. Stimulant compounds enhance endurance and reduce fatigue. Psychedelic compounds produce states that may enhance certain forms of pattern recognition and associative thinking. Ancient humans who used these plants were not simply seeking intoxication. They were, whether or not they would have described it this way, pharmacologically managing the demands and challenges of ancient life. Let's come back to where we started. The ancient human by the fire, the plant burning in the embers, the smoke carrying something different than ordinary wood smoke carries. They breathed it it in. Not deliberately the first time, but they noticed. And because noticing was how ancient humans learned about their world, because the entire edifice of ancient human technological and pharmacological knowledge was built on exactly this kind of attentive observation and deliberate follow-up, the noticing led to curiosity. The curiosity led to experimentation. The experimentation led to knowledge. The knowledge was shared, refined, embedded in social practice, and transmitted across generations until it became part of the accumulated cultural inheritance of communities that had been working with these plants for longer than modern civilization has existed. Did ancient humans smoke? Yes. Not in the branded cigarette corner store purchase. Daily habit sense that the word smoking conjures in a modern context, but in the more fundamental sense of deliberately using combustion to release psychoactive compounds from plants and inhaling the resulting smoke for purposes that were medical, ritual, social, and experiential. Ancient humans were doing exactly this, across multiple continents using multiple plant species, going back further into the ancient past than the direct evidence can currently confirm with certainty. The evidence is chemical residue in ancient braziers, it is tobacco seeds preserved in ancient pouches, it is pipe fragments at ancient sites, it is psychoactive plant pollen and seeds in ancient hearth contexts. It is the cross-cultural universality of psychoactive plant use in traditional societies on every continent. It is the specific receptor systems built into every human brain that were waiting, across millions of years of human evolution, for exactly the compounds that these plants produce. Ancient humans were curious, systematic, observant, and thoroughly human in their desire to understand and explore every dimension of their experience, including the dimensions that specific plants, burned or otherwise consumed, made available. They found those plants. They used them. They built knowledge systems around them. They passed that knowledge down. We are their descendants, in every sense of the word.